Hello, welcome to another of my Thursday Toast talks where I try to uh, explain terms that people might come across if they're historians or other members of the general public that are of a sort of medical type nature to try and help people to understand them. The title is a reference to toast from the Royal Navy, traditionally given on a Thursday, although I believe it's no longer part of the official policy on these things. A toast to bloody battles and sickly seasons, on the grounds that's how you get promoted. This was requested by Alex Clarke.
A quick note of caution I'd like to add is that this is not intended as medical advice and isn't representing current medical practice. What I'm intending to do with this is to get across some of the concepts from history so that you can better understand things when you are going through a book or reading about a biography and it talks about somebody's ill health. I would advise people to seek professional assistance if they have any questions or look for advice, and to also use reliable web sources. For example, the NHS websites are a good place to go if you want to find stuff out. Do not rely on random people on YouTube. Do not rely on random websites. Remember that anyone can put up a website, anyone can put up a YouTube video, anyone can edit Wikipedia.
So, as I said, this was requested by Alex Clarke. I hate you, Alex. I hate you a lot. This is a ridiculously complicated topic. And I think there are three reasons for that. One, the brain is complicated. Two, we're talking about something with a huge variety of severity. Three, the mechanisms through which the injury can occur vary hugely. So I can't just build a table kind of going, well, it's a kind of severe due to this, and so it'll have these effects. Just doesn't work. Just doesn't work. So, what can I do? Well, let me start by trying to talk about the first one of those two words, the brain. So, comparisons to computers are, in this case, oversimplified, certainly in terms of the kind of hardware. I suppose you could compare the brain to the internet and say that each of the little brain cells is like an individual computer in the internet network, but that doesn't really work and hold water either. It's just a thing. So different bits of the brain do different things, and there's variation from person to person, and there's variation according to what it is you're doing. One bit of brain, for instance, may control speaking, and another controls singing. So if you get damage to the bit of your brain that does speaking, you may be able to get away with singing instead of speaking to communicate. So you can't talk, but you can sing. So you just have to teach yourself to sing so it sounds like speaking. Part of the reason for this is also that when one bit of the brain stops working or is damaged or whatever, another bit may pick up the slack and may do it in slightly odd ways, and who knows. So it's worth saying one of the main ways we know about these things is by seeing what happens to people who suffer a brain injury and just testing and figuring things out and figuring out what's wrong with their brain, which in the past used to mean waiting until they were dead and then cutting the skull open and having a look, which these days we can sometimes do scans, but equally if things are at a really microscopic level, can't. So it's really tricky. Now for the injury part. So there's a huge number of ways to damage the brain or the brain cells or both, or yeah, and the severity can be incredibly variable, both in terms of the effects and how much might be damaged and things like that. And it's really unpredictable, both in terms of you can seemingly put two people through the same experience, but they'll end up with different injuries, which will manifest in different ways. Or, one person won't be affected, another person will be, or, it'll be in some bit of you that's hidden because that bit of you isn't being stimulated. This is I suppose, partly to do with the idea of, there would be cavemen who would have been amazing computer programmers, but they didn't have computers. So they sat there and made second-rate flint hand axes. But, if they'd been given the right tools and things, they'd have done something better. I know they aren't really cavemen, but go with it. So talking about these things and assessing it is so difficult that I can't create a simple answer to what's going on. And the other thing is we keep finding new stuff. Partly that's to do with just new experiences. I think one of the more recent things has been the kind of idea of the kind of repetitive, more minor traumas causing damage that to some extent we probably couldn't pick up on scans and things, and weren't seeing so much from things like post-mortem studies from people being unfortunately blown up repeatedly in the sort of and that. And I think the other big thing's been in American football, but it's kind of a known thing that footballers who had the ball a lot and things weren't necessarily quite right in the head, but or would sort of suffer and struggle. But equally, there might have been other reasons, socioeconomic. There could be confounders. There could be that they have a tendency to drink too much, or who knows what. This is the problem. But yeah, we keep finding new things. So last and not least, the dangers of trying to kind of make a retrospective or historical diagnosis around brain injuries. So much of what we know only becomes clear when you do kind of modern assessments. So there are things which we wouldn't classify as a brain injury, or not necessarily the type of brain injury that you might think of, that might have been mistaken for that. So before we had scans, you couldn't really tell whether, for example, a stroke was due to bleeding or a blood clot. So, and to some extent, could be a struggle to tell it from a brain tumor. Now, these days, we put you through a CT scanner or an MRI scanner, or both, and figure these things out very quickly, or slightly more slowly in the case of an MRI scanner, but pretty quickly. And these things didn't happen. You can also get a variety of conditions which might be lumped with mental illness or psychological illness rather than physical illness, although I will confess that I'm not necessarily entirely sure that we get the balance of these things right in even the modern era. I think that our split of mental illness versus physical illness is probably a bit too absolute, and that's a bit unhelpful, but never mind. That's also to do with historic underfunding of mental health services and stigma and all that kind of thing. And another thing is you can get things like infections, which might have been more should we say, rampant in the past, pre-antibiotics, at least some of which can have neurological conditions. I'm looking at you, syphilis. So, and the other thing that makes it really hard to talk about somebody from history having a brain injury, for sure, is that frankly the sort of sources of information you'll often have on a historical figure are not really what you would rely on in a modern context if you're looking to make a diagnosis. So a huge amount of what you do as a doctor is called history take, is based on what's called the history. And that's the story of how did we get here. And that enables you to put everything into context, because history is about context. Everything is about context. And you're just not getting the right kind of information, partly because you're going to have very different concepts and expectations and things from different people in those eras. So by which I mean that the people would ascribe symptoms to being due to other things that we would put down to something else, and you can't question and clarify and confirm what people actually mean, which is part of why I'm doing this, to try and help a little bit with the difficulties with meanings of things to different people. Anyway, so my conclusion is that brain injuries are complicated, and it's not that it's an unhelpful term, because it can be useful so that somebody can explain what is wrong with them in a simple way without having to go into lots of detail about what caused it, exactly what the effects are, and all those sorts of things. In that sense, it's useful in the current era. On the other hand, trying to pin it onto people and say, whoa, Henry VIII, the reason he suddenly went mad and bad and nasty was because when he had that big jousting accident, he suffered a traumatic brain injury, and that led to personality change. I don't know. Maybe you just can't tell. You just don't know. You don't have enough information to say that. So, you know, it would be a hypothetical thing, but equally he apparently had a wound after that, which took ages to heal, so chronic pain. He could have been depressed. He could have had syphilis. He could have had who knows what wrong with him. And that's the problem. You can't say. You can chuck it in as a possible, but you can't say what it is for sure at all. So yeah, I hate you, Alex Clarke. I hate you so much. This has not been the kind of thing I wanted to talk about. I want to talk about nice things like, I don't know, smallpox and big pox, which is syphilis, and TB and scurvy and things. So hopefully those things will be coming up at some point, but I'm happy to kind of take requests if there are things people aren't sure about, what's meant, and want a bit of context. I'd love to try and help. So drop, put a note or whatever on, and let me know. So thank you very much.